It's hard to believe we are already here, the third month of our year of color. I think one thing I have learned in this crazy journey with the wool and spinning community is that things just fly by so quickly. I feel like we barely finish one thing and we are on to the next, just raring to go. Last month, we looked at optical mixing and creating mud in our hand-spun skeins. We explored how truly difficult that is to create mud intentionally, since the colors we can achieve are so beautiful. We learned to describe color in 3 steps: the hue family, the value of the color, so how light or how dark, and finally, how saturated the color is, how bright or dull. In the Wool Circle, we've been exploring all things color wheels, from demos to spinning. This month, we are delving into the world of color contrasts. In part 1, we defined what color contrasts are and how we use them. And then we got into the first one, namely contrast of hue, to see how we can use that in our spinning. Alongside that work, though, we paused with a quick reminder of all of the color-related definitions. We've already covered a lot in the last 2 months, and as we ease into the color contrasts, it's nice to quickly recap. If you are interested in seeing part 1 but haven't joined the wool and spinning community just yet, please head to patreon.com/woolandspinning/join. I'm excited to welcome you into the community. So as in previous months, this is the second part of a 2-part series this month. In the first part, we laid the foundation of information and think of that as the foundational knowledge. And then in the second part, we showcase how we apply the learning in our spinning. What does contrast of hue look like in our spinning? How can we take advantage of it? Sometimes just being aware of this stuff is a good place to start, even if we aren't necessarily ready to experiment with it in our making. Spoiler alert though, we use this stuff all the time. We just might not realize there is an actual name for it. As usual, I also put a call out to the wool and spinning community for their participation in the contrast of hue this month. I was really curious about what they would produce, particularly because not everyone has access to Menz's book to see what she did. I'm excited to share with you their work today. It was so much fun to see what everyone came up with, so let's get into it. If you are new here, please take a moment to check out the indices linked for you in the Patreon post and in the down bar below if you are watching this on YouTube. To be able to see all of the posts that are available to you each month, please have a look at the Ketchup and Pickles housekeeping post for March of 2003 that will be released around the middle of the month. On Wool and Spinning Radio this month, Rebecca and I sat down with our very own Tajiana of the Stitches and Starlight podcast to talk about her use of color in her work. Check it out on all of your major podcast providers. All right, onwards. So I had the opportunity to explore contrast of hue, albeit briefly, in my Unit 2 on Color and Design in the Ontario Handweavers and Spinners Master Weaver program. I shared an example earlier this month in our part 1 discussion of a classic advertisement that uses contrast of hue. Here I share with you some examples from my own samples that show contrast of hue. These examples work because the saturation of each yarn is the same. They might not be pretty or particularly interesting as there is a lack of depth and interest, but they are effective. Honestly, it reminds me of toddlers with crayons, but in the medium of yarn instead. Contrast of hue is most evident when the colors are undiluted and therefore at their full saturation. These are all woven samples, but they show contrast of hue because the viewer is able to clearly see the differences between the basic colors, whether cyan, magenta, and yellow, green, orange, and royal blue, or red, and so on. We learned earlier this month that red, yellow, and blue are the strongest contrast of hues available to us, that the secondary hues are weaker, and so on. Here, the viewer can see that this is the case. The stripes on the warp of the three different primaries are easily seen due to the high juxtaposition between them. Remember, they are as far away from one another on the color wheel as possible. With the introduction of some of those secondaries in the weft, there isn't as strong a contrast between some of those hues and the color in that stripe, but overall there is contrast, and one can see where one color ends and another one starts. I also did some spinning this month to see what I could come up with. I blended the primaries red, blue, and yellow on one time and dizzed off, and then I repeated the process, but I blended that one many times to create a muddy, dull skein. The difference between the two is remarkable, as is the knitted fabric. So you can see where in the knitted fabric that I was dizzing off the hand card, the colors started to blend more than the initial fiber. As I removed the colors, even though I hadn't done any carding, I had just loaded the cards and dizzed off, it steadily started to blend without any effort on my part. This section of the swatch before I cut and attached the blended triad was becoming more and more heathered. This didn't show the contrast of hue quite as clearly as the beginning of the swatch. Very interesting that as the colors dizzed off in varying lengths, slightly blending on their own, that they created that triadic effect, moving away from being more obvious in the skein and the yarn, limiting the effects of contrast of hue. In many ways, my color wheel swatch shows contrast of hue more clearly because the colors are spun and knit separately into a length of fabric. I love that we can continue to play with these concepts, experimenting and understanding how they will affect our finished yarns. So let's see what the community did with this experimentation. It was super interesting. Remember from part one of that each month I will be putting out a call to the community for their interpretations on color. Here's the call that I put out to everyone on both Slack and Ravelry. In March, we will be getting started with the 7 color contrasts as defined by Itten in 1973. We will be starting with the contrast of hue. Contrast of hue is the simplest of all the color contrasts. If you haven't worked with color contrasts previously, no problem. We will learn what they are in March, but in the meantime, attempt to create a skein or two that uses, quote, 3 distinctly different hues in a single design. That's from Men's 2004. Remember that the most extreme use of contrast of hue is the 3 primaries, red, yellow, and blue, RYB, or cyan, yellow, and magenta, CYM. None have hues in common, and enjoy playing. So I can't wait to share with you what they put together. It's incredible. So firstly, Amanda shared some of her previous work that shows contrast of hue beautifully. Thank you, Amanda. So here's the first one. Sample number 1 is called The Answer Lies in Shadow, 2012-ish, 2013. Solar absorption spectrum as canvas work embroidery. At viewing different distance, it is all prismatic hues with black lines and relies on contrast of hue. Close up, you can see it is all optical blending. This is the first thing that comes to mind for me when thinking about prismatic hues, and I wish I had better photos of it. Thanks to my dad for taking these close-ups. He has been looking after it for me while I'm living abroad. Isn't this beautiful? I love this. So gorgeous. I'll let the photos cycle through for just a moment so that you guys can see her work. And Amanda's just so freaking cute. Lovely work, Amanda. Thank you for sharing. So here is Amanda's second sample. Sample number 2 is a twill variation from 2022. It's a twill variation in wool with yellow warp and blue and red wefts. This fabric always makes me think of a paillette Mondrian. I always say that incorrectly. I probably butchered it, but I know who that painter is. Lovely, Amanda. What a great use of color, contrast of hue. And then finally, Amanda went on to see what she could make in terms of yarn, which is a fascinating experiment. And here's what she had to say. I was thinking about how to spin yarn that maximized the contrast of hue. I used a palette of commercial merino top in red, yellow, blue, yellow, black, and white. I wanted to avoid optimal mixing, so the units of each color needed to be large. This meant that I decided not to explore color via standard plying. I rarely make novelty yarns, so I also was approaching this as playing with size and shape. I spun 2 different yarns, one with a black base and one with a white base. The black yarn I spun as a single with cocoons in the primary colors, and the white yarn was spun the same way, but then spiral plied with a white silk sewing thread, folding the cocoons to create loops and halos. Isn't that incredible? Love these yarns. But then just wait. Wait what she did next. Ah, amazing. The black yarn I knit as a stockinette swatch, and the white yarn I knit as a garter swatch. And look at how unbelievably different they are. Isn't that cool? I have to admit, I can't pick which one I like better. I like them both. I think they're amazing. Thank you, Amanda, for your sharing and for your work. I really appreciate the time and energy that you put into this. This is from Ruth. Ruth shares her findings with us in the following ways. So as I examined contrast of hue, I reached into my stash of hand-spun fleece and finished objects to examine how I think about this. I started with winding low contrast hues of fleece together to high contrast hues, magenta red, yellow, yellow green, and finally blue orange. If I were to combo spin or ply these colors, I believe my preferences would be for red and magenta, for the red and magenta colorway. I think it would retain the strongest hue statement, whereas the other 2 blends would start looking a bit muddy. If I were to spin each color combination as 2 separate yarns and knit them together, I would be drawn to the high contrast. Then I pulled out spun stash and looked at the high contrast of hue to low contrast. Orange, dark blue of the same value, red, orange, light blue, and finally light green and light blue. My preference is the high contrast orange with dark blue. I looked at some of my recent projects. The socks are still on my needles, but I obviously picked a high contrast of hue to make the color dots pop on each, on the top of the instep. On the bottom across the foot, I knit stripes, and you can see where the lower contrast hues, the purple against the blue, does not stand out as well as the orange against the blue. Overall, the project tends to have a high contrast of hue, and the results makes me quite happy. Finally, my favorite example is an unconscious choice of contrast of hue to make a fabric. This scrappy hat was made from predominantly the red family mix of colors. That's this one here. I threw in greens, purple, and orange for more visual interest, and it is certainly one of my favorite fabrics from this past year. I'm sure it is because of the high contrast of hue that comes from the greens. Very cool, Ruth. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. I really appreciate it. And this one is from Sarah. Sarah shares her first attempts to create a multi-hue yarn. Here's my first attempt at creating a skein that uses 3 distinctly different hues in a single design. It is a 2-ply, 1 bobbin spun using blocks of the 3 hues. The other bobbin was spun using the 3 hues of fiber, which had been gently hand carding once to break up the blocks, but not a blend. I am actually quite happy with the result. I can see that the plying technique could have quite an impact visually with regards to color on the finished fiber. I think I will do this exercise again using the 3 colors on 3 bobbins and cable ply. I imagine a 4-ply cable, the colors would be distinctly less distinct and probably a bit muddy, particularly from a distance. But a 3-ply cable would mean the 2 colors plied together would blend and the 3rd color would be way more prominent. Maybe this won't look so good. I think you should give it a try, Sarah. I think it would be really interesting. I think from a distance, it would end up looking like dots of color, and then up close, you would be able to see the nuances in the spun singles. I think it would be a really interesting experiment. And if you do that experiment, please share it, and then I can share it later here. This one is from Dominique. She shares her experiences from her own projects and going through what she's already made. I try to figure out the contrast of hue by looking back in my Ravelry projects. The cushion is one of my last color work. It was magenta, cyan, and green. Some Easter eggs have only 2 colors, and the shawl was spun fractal out of a bright rainbow top. Arnie and Carlos also used bright colors in their designs, especially Easter and garden themes, and I made an egg to add to my collection. It's surprising that the yellow I considered as cool, but it seems to be warmer next to the red. Very interesting, Dominique. Thank you for sharing. So Florence shares her explorations. While working on the contrast of hue exercise, I was very aware of the nature of knitting, which tends to have significant areas of color, frequently delineated in straight lines. So the relationship with the neighboring area is as important as within the area itself. I took 4 of my favorite colors in red, yellow, blue, and green. Visually, they look very similar with full color saturation. I knitted a sample using blue as the contrast background to show the high and low contrast in hue of my color choices. What became apparent was that I had created something that I personally want to avoid in color work, the dominant line. By filtering to black and white, I was able to see why. As a comparison, I knitted a sample using the red as the constant background. This eliminated the dominant line and confirmed that for my taste, I should not rely on contrast of hue alone in the planning stages. Thank you so much, Florence, for sharing your findings. I thought the discussion about the dominant line was very interesting because I don't do a lot of color work like some of you guys do, and that was something that I hadn't thought about before. So thank you. And finally, Eveline shares, I was having some trouble with the contrast of hue exercise, but then I looked at my feet. These socks are from a few years ago. They're not hand spun and they're knit at a looser gauge than I do nowadays, but still. The yellow and red are close on value, but not the same. The yellow is still slightly lighter. It's just the green that's very dark. I really like how different the pattern looks if you switch around the foreground and the background colors. Thank you so much to everybody who shared. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, the time that you took to engage in the activity and engage in the assignment, quote unquote. It means a lot to me, so thank you. As always, you guys, please share your work in the Slack channel and under hashtag Year of Color, or in the Ravelry group under Year of Color thread. Be sure to share your projects, your spins, and your makes using hashtag Wool and Spinning so that others can see your work as well. And don't hesitate to tag me or Rebecca at RebbyJ so that we can see your stuff as well. We always really love seeing it. In the meantime, YouTube's algorithm is recommending a video from Wool and Spinning that it thinks that you will enjoy. So I hope that you click on it and that you enjoy it. Until next time, happy spinning. I hope you guys have a great rest of your March. Bye, everyone.